it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Deborah Cameron, who's Professor of Language and Communication at Worcester College, University of Oxford. Deborah previously held teaching positions at Roehampton, University of Strathclyde, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and the Institute of Education at UCL. And Debbie's produced numerous, almost countless landmark articles and weighty books, including Verbal Hygiene, which she published in 1995, and I think which we'll hear a little bit about today. Verbal Hygiene was republished, of course, again in 2012 in the Classics of Linguistics series from Routledge. Other notable books I have cited Professor Cameron very many times, including her 2001 work, Working with Spoken Discourse, Language and Sexuality, which she published with Don Kellick in 2003, and The Myth of Mars and Venus in 2007. And the title of Debbie's plenary lecture this afternoon is The Trouble with Oracy, with a provocative question mark. So we'll hear more about that. And I'll put this up in the chat. If you want to participate, respond, please do so using the Q&A function. I'll also put up in the chat just here Debbie's Twitter handle. So if you want to mention any aspects of the plenary today, you'd be very warmly invited to do so. Again, I'll hand over now to Debbie. Thanks very, very much, Deborah, for joining us this afternoon. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here. I saw a tweet this morning that said, hear what linguists really think about oracy. So I should just say that I'm not linguist in general, I'm just one, which brings me to my first question. Who am I to talk about this? I'm a sociolinguist, someone who studies the relationship of the linguistic to the social. And over the years, I have done a lot of research and writing about what I call verbal hygiene. Which is the conscious efforts made by users of a language to clean up the messiness of language as it really exists and bring it into alignment with their notions of value. So what's correct or incorrect, efficient or inefficient, beautiful or ugly, morally good or morally bad. It's a broader concept than what's usually meant by the familiar term prescriptivism. For me, prescriptivism is a type of verbal hygiene where the central value is correctness, which is usually equated with the use of a standardized language variety. It tends to be elitist and conservative. But there are types of verbal hygiene which are not elitist or conservative and which are more concerned with values like utility or social equality. And for instance, campaigns for plain language or for inclusive language. All verbal hygiene has a political dimension because the value judgments that animate it are not just judgments about language. They're also implicitly and sometimes explicitly judgments on what constitutes a desirable social order, and within that social order, what makes someone a good person, a good learner, a good worker, a good citizen. Among the types of verbal hygiene that I've studied in detail, two are particularly relevant to the concerns of this conference. First, debates on how schools in the UK should teach the English language to children and young people, which I've written about in various places, including the book Verbal Hygiene. And second, the practice of communication skills training, which I wrote about in my 2000 book, Good to Talk. Communication skills training is mainly associated with settings other than schools, and particularly with the workplace. And in most cases, its main focus is oral rather than written communication. In schools, by contrast, there is a general perception that literacy is the main focus, and that by comparison, as Andrew Wilkinson put it in the opening sentence of his 1965 article, The Concept of Oracy, the spoken language has been shamefully neglected. And this complaint was not new in 1965. I will later be showing you examples going back as far as 1919. And it's still, of course, being made today. Here's an example, 60 years after Wilkinson's intervention, nearly 60 years. Here's an example from the English Speaking Union's website, which notes that oracy gets much less attention in the school curriculum than literacy and numeracy, and argues that this neglect is, if not shameful, then at least short-sighted. It points out that employers rate communication skills as more important than formal academic qualifications, and goes on to claim that in addition to making students more employable, oracy enhances their academic performance and boosts their social, emotional, and interpersonal skills. So these arguments associate oracy, or communication skills, with the making of the good worker, the good learner, and the good person. To understand the nature and significance of this contemporary defense of oracy, I think we have to look back to the 1980s, when the political decision was made to introduce a statutory national curriculum for schools in England and Wales. This prompted a public debate in which the teaching of the English language became a particular flashpoint. It was at the centre of what we would now call a culture war discourse, orchestrated mainly by right-wing think tanks like the Centre for Policy Studies. What the right wanted the curriculum to do in general terms was crush the progressive education movement, which had allegedly been dominant since the 1960s. And the teaching of English became a key symbol of everything that was wrong with that. Schools were accused of abandoning the rigorous standards of the past and adopting a permissive, anything goes approach that left children both illiterate, unable to spell properly or put a grammatical sentence together, and lacking the discipline inculcated by traditional teaching methods like spelling tests and grammatical drills. Linguistic standards were persistently equated with moral and behavioural standards, as the Thatcherite politician Norman Tebbit famously told a BBC interviewer in 1985, "If you allow standards to slip to the stage where good English is no better than bad English, where people turn up filthy at school, all these things tend to cause people to have no standards at all. And once you lose standards, there's no imperative to stay out of crime." Oracy at that time was quite strongly associated with the progressive approach. It incorporated ideas about how children learn, which were at odds with the traditional view that teachers should do the talking and pupils should speak only when spoken to. The right was not in favour of it. As they saw it, a classroom where children were encouraged to talk extensively was unrigorous, undisciplined, and not sufficiently focused on the basics. Because of that, the eventual inclusion of speaking and listening in the new national curriculum was widely, in fact, seen as a victory for the progressive camp. But if so, it was temporary. This element of the original English curriculum has been watered down considerably since, especially in the last 10 years, and generally on the grounds that even more time and attention needed to be given to the basics of literacy. So I'm laying this history out a bit because I think it helps to explain why contemporary advocates of oracy, like the ESU, make the kinds of arguments they do. Implicitly, they're trying to make a case for spoken language teaching which resonates with the values of the people who've had power since the 1980s. So the point they emphasize is that far from being an unrigorous distraction from the basics, oracy is itself basic, for instance, more important to employers than being able to solve equations. Oracy gets associated with qualities like self-awareness, confidence, resilience, empathy, mobilizing what we might call a neoliberal discourse of the self about the good person and the good worker, which didn't feature much in the 1980s debate, but has since become the accepted wisdom of the corporate world. What these arguments do is decouple oracy from the progressive side of its history and make something more like a business case for it. And I'm going to suggest later on that this has in some ways only added to what I'm calling the trouble with oracy. Now, I've been laying out so far what you might call the standard contemporary view on what the trouble with oracy is. It's that the education system hasn't paid enough attention to it. Its importance hasn't been fully appreciated, policymakers haven't treated it as a priority, teachers haven't been given the resources they need to develop it, and so on. I'm going to bracket the question of whether that's actually true, Clearly, it is true that current provision for it in schools is, to quote a 2016 report, patchy. But I do think there is a tendency to exaggerate the neglect and downplay the progress that has been made since 1965, when, according to Wilkinson, the only spoken language skill that got any attention was reading aloud. But as I say, I'm going to bracket that, because what I really want to explore in this talk is another kind of trouble with oracy, which I think may help us to understand why complaints about its vital but neglected status have been going on for more than 100 years. Putting it in the most basic terms, I think the trouble is that there is no societal consensus on what actually constitutes good spoken communication. Everyone can agree on the importance of, in Andrew Wilkinson's words, the ability to use the oral skills of speaking and listening. But it's not so easy to get agreement on what that means in concrete terms. There are ideological reasons for that, which I'll be talking about in a minute. But first, I want to point out that there are also some basic linguistic reasons why defining or setting standards for speaking is genuinely hard, and certainly harder than doing the same for reading and writing. There is, of course, plenty of debate about what should be taught in schools under the heading of reading and writing. In the 1980s, a highly politicized question was whether too much attention was being given to creative writing, as opposed to the basic mechanics of grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And in the last 2 weeks, we've had, a row about synthetic phonics. But one thing there really isn't much disagreement about is that children do need to be taught those basics in some way. Schools should produce students who can both read and write in the standard variety of the national language. This is what fundamentally defines literacy for the average person. If you think it's a partial and superficial definition or a socially exclusionary one, I don't disagree. My claim is simply that there is a high level of societal consensus on it. And it's also clear what counts as mastering the basics, because the written standard form of the language, as it says on this slide, is very highly codified. If you're not sure whether something is grammatically correct, spelled correctly, you can look it up in a dictionary, a grammar book, a style guide. The standard form isn't totally invariant, of course, no language is, but generally speaking, you can look at a piece of writing in English and say, this is standard, this is not standard, or as many people would put it, this is correct English, this is a mistake. With spoken language, matters are more complicated. There is no highly codified norm for speech as such. When people talk about standard spoken English, that generally means they're applying the rules of the written standard to speech. And in reality, most kinds of speech, even produced by highly educated speakers, do not consistently conform to those rules, for the very good reason that the affordances of the medium are different. For instance, unless we're using it for a scripted presentation like this one, we have to produce and decode spoken language in real time, with little planning, no opportunity to revise and edit. And whereas writing has to be able to stand on its own because the reader isn't co-present to interact with the writer, what we do with spoken language is radically shaped by the context we're speaking in and the dynamics of the group we're speaking in. All of this makes speech highly variable, and a lot of that variation is stuff we don't have much conscious awareness of because we didn't learn to speak our first language through the kind of formal instruction that draws your attention to the rules you're following. So what I'm saying is that for reading and writing, we as a society have a shared sense of what the basics are, what abilities or skills define a good or good enough communicator. And to the extent that we disagree about the details, we at least start with a clear idea of what we're arguing about. For speaking and listening, we don't have that kind of clarity. So whenever it becomes necessary to define what we actually concretely mean by good in relation to spoken communication, one or both of two things tend to happen. The first is that we fall back on the kinds of norms that we're used to applying to written communication, though in the case of speech that may be irrelevant or counterproductive. And the second is that we invent criteria for measuring skill in speech, which may make sense within a particular community of practice, but which turn out not to be obvious or uncontroversial in society as a whole. Different stakeholders may have completely different ideas of what skill means in relation to speaking and about which skills a good communicator needs. For example, every employer I interviewed for my book, Good to Talk, told me that good communication skills were a top priority in recruiting people to be call center agents or retail assistants. But what they meant by good communication skills was completely different from any educational definition of oracy. They weren't looking for people who could make a cogent argument or a well-structured presentation or do collaborative problem solving through talk. They were looking for people who could speak intelligibly, follow a script, and build rapport with customers on the phone. One call center manager also told me he looked for people who could tolerate being shouted and sworn at by angry customers. Judgments on good communication always reflect assumptions and preferences which are not neutral and universal. They're context specific and socially or politically loaded. That's true for writing as well as speech, but the long historical process of standardizing and then teaching writing has produced a strong sense among literate people that their judgments are not just arbitrary and subjective. With speech, the lack of consensus or clarity is much more noticeable. I want to give you some actual examples of the way this problem tends to play out, starting with the issue of transferring norms and the associated value judgments from writing to speech, whether or not it makes linguistic or educational sense. So if you do a basic Google search for the definition of oracy, you'll find definitions like the ones I've put on this slide. And what I want to draw your attention to is the adverbs. We've got two references to speaking grammatically or grammatically correctly, which implies that oracy is being defined in part as the ability to adhere in speech to the norms of standard English, which, as I said before, is essentially a standard for writing. Then we've got evaluative terms like fluently, clearly, effectively, and well, which are more open to interpretation than grammatically, but are easily recuperated to the same understanding of good spoken communication as mostly a matter of surface form, using good grammar and pronunciation, avoiding features like disfluency, although they are actually typical of spoken language. Now, this surface stuff is absolutely not what most of the original advocates of oracy in education meant when they used the term, but it does seem increasingly to be what's emphasized in and to schools. One striking example is the increasingly common practice of adopting school policies that ban certain words, grammatical forms, or pronunciation in speech on the grounds that they aren't standard English, but either dialect or slang. So the ban applies in principle to all contexts, informal playground talk as well as more formal classroom talk. And as you can see in the image I'm showing you, which is a document produced by a school in Teesside, the school is also asking parents to correct children's speech at home. The prohibited forms include not only localized grammatical forms and pronunciations like, I done it for I did it, and work instead of work, but also, dunno, a contracted form of I don't know, which is common in the informal spoken English of all regions and classes. What's behind this seems to be a belief that if children aren't corrected when they speak, they'll reproduce these same non-standard forms when they write. As well as oversimplifying the relationship between speech and writing, this turns oracy into the handmaid of literacy, rather than treating it as a skill that needs to be developed in its own right. According to research by Ian Cushing, what you're looking at is a photo of a poster that was taped on the wall of each classroom in a school where he did field work. Another common policy is that in schools is that students should speak in complete sentences, ask and answer questions in full sentences. In some recent research with Julia Snell, Cushing has found that this policy is also explicitly commended in Ofsted reports. From a linguistic point of view, though, it's an obvious category mistake. Complete sentences, defined by their syntax, are the grammatical building blocks of written discourse, but not of most speech. In unplanned speech, we divide information into processable chunks using prosody, so pitch, stress, pausing. Speech also makes extensive use of economy features like ellipsis, which produce incomplete sentences. If someone shows you a picture of a squirrel in a tree and asks you, where is the squirrel? You answer, in the tree, rather than repeating what's already given information for your interlocutor by saying, the squirrel is in the tree. That's actually a famous example used by the pioneering sociolinguist William Labov to critique the assumptions made about African-American children's language skills in the 1960s. Psychologists had claimed that answering in the tree to the question about the squirrel was one sign of the linguistic and cognitive deficit that was said to be responsible for Black pupils' educational underachievement relative to their white counterparts. Labov pointed out that this was absurd. Ellipsis in speech is normal and not a sign of any kind of deficit. Drilling children to speak incomplete sentences isn't teaching them anything they don't already know about language structure. So these examples illustrate 2 points about the way speaking well tends to be conceptualized. First, that it reflects misconceptions about spoken language in general, but second, that it reflects the common sense equation of good speech with the speech of people of high social status. That leads not only to the kind of thing you saw in the Teesside example, an obsession with eradicating non-standard grammar and pronunciation, but also to the idea, the broader idea, that developing spoken language skills means giving non-elite children access to elite communicative practices, like, say, debating or formal public speaking, which will enable them to cultivate the personal qualities and dispositions that make elite pupils so successful in later life. So an explainer piece about Oracy, which was published in The Conversation in 2014, made this point explicitly. A recent report confirms that the alumni of British public schools still control politics and many top professions. One reason those people are so successful in public life is that their shared history gives them privileged networking connections, but they are also commonly very confident, fluent public speakers. They were not born that way. Their skills were developed through their school experience of debating societies, blah, blah, blah. So their education included oracy as well as literacy and numeracy. But what isn't really being interrogated here is the basis on which we value the communicative habits of highly privileged people. Are these inherently valuable skills which less privileged people have been unfairly denied? Or is their value just a byproduct of the status the people we associate them with? In Britain, attempts to define and set standards for good spoken communication have always had a tendency to kind of slide past that question. And they've often become bogged down in the minutiae of the linguistic social class distinctions, which make it, as George Bernard Shaw famously observed in the preface to his play Pygmalion, impossible for one Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman despise him. Now, almost 100 years ago, in 1926, Shaw became one of the founder members of a committee formed by the British Broadcasting Corporation under John Reith to advise it on questions of spoken English. The SEEK, as I will call it for brevity, was chaired by the poet laureate Robert Bridges, who's pictured on the right there, and Shaw in the middle was the deputy chairman, who succeeded to the chair when Bridges died in 1930. The secretary was Arthur Lloyd James, lecturer in phonetics at what's now SOAS, and the other founder members included Britain's foremost phonetician, Daniel Jones, an actor, Sir Forbes Robertson, and the essayist, Logan Pearsall Smith, who represented a group called the Society for Pure English, which I'll speak a little more about in a minute. Between 1926 and 1939, when the outbreak of war led the BBC to suspend all its external committees, the SEEK recruited various other luminaries, some of whom I have listed on the slide. It was typical of its time in consisting mainly of men of letters, who were considered the obvious authorities on language, but it was innovative in including some people with a more scientific training in what would become linguistics, so phonetics or philology. The committee's job on paper was simply to make recommendations on how BBC announcers should pronounce words where there was some uncertainty about how to pronounce them. And that was a genuine issue. In the early years of radio, announcers who'd been educated before the advent of broadcasting were constantly being presented with scripts containing words they might never have heard anyone speak aloud, ranging from obscure English place names to scientific technical terms to words borrowed from a foreign language. For instance, at one meeting from the minutes survived from, the committee debated whether the Hawaiian instrument should be called by the BBC a ukulele or an ukulele. But what makes their work of interest for the purposes of this talk, although I could give many more amusing examples, is that some of them, and some people within the BBC, had a much more ambitious view of their role. So I'm really sorry that I can't hear your responses to reading this slide. But as you can see from the quotes I've put on it, and these are taken from documents preserved in the BBC's written archive in Reading, there was a very general belief that the new technology of radio would have a profound influence on the speech of the nation and possibly the entire Anglophone world. Some people saw this as a historic opportunity to model the norms of elite spoken English, both the pronunciation and the style, for the benefit of a mass non-elite audience listening this time not in a classroom, but in their own homes. We now know that exposure to language via mass media has a pretty limited effect on listeners' own grammar or pronunciation. But in the 1920s, there was no way for anybody to know that. Broadcasting was new. There was particular enthusiasm about the potential for children's programs to change the way working class children spoke. Children were, after all, good mimics and had a strong investment in their favorite programs. Now, this line of argument was very much in the spirit of the Newbolt report on the teaching of English, which had been published just a few years earlier in 1921. The Newbolt Committee had found that standards of English in state schools were poor, with a complete neglect of spoken language. But they also commented that English was terribly neglected in the public schools, the independent schools, where it was, of course, subordinate to the classical languages. And the committee felt that this exacerbated class differences and antagonism between the classes. They recommended that English could and should serve as the basis for a national culture shared by all classes. If the teaching of the language were properly and universally provided for, the difference between educated and uneducated speech, which at present causes so much prejudice and difficulty of intercourse on both sides, would gradually disappear. Good speech and great literature would not be regarded as too fine for use by the majority, nor on the other hand would natural gifts for self-expression be rendered ineffective by embarrassing faults in diction or composition. The BBC believed it had a part to play in this construction of a national culture for all classes, and some people in the institution, though not all, viewed the construction and dissemination of norms for good spoken English as part of that. It's become a truism that the BBC under Leith presented and promoted an extremely narrowly defined linguistic norm, which was essentially, excuse me, the English of upper-class public school educated men. And that isn't wrong. You only have to listen to recordings from the 1920s and 30s to confirm the basic truth of it. But the documents in the archives show that behind the scenes, there was debate on what BBC English should be like. No one questioned that it should represent an educated form of speech, but there were some influential Sikh members who did question whether it should simply reproduce the accents and the communicative practices of an existing social elite. Robert Bridges and the Society for Pure English, which he had co-founded, were very critical of the upper-class English of the early 20th century. Indeed, Bridges told the Times in 1928 that he had accepted the BBC's invitation to serve on the committee because I thought it my duty to do what I could to prevent the intrusion of the slipshod conversational form of speech that some call Southern English and some public school pronunciation, which is threatening the language. The Society for Pure English considered the English cultivated in public schools to be affected, pedantic, overly influenced by classicism, and not in keeping with the true character of the language. I'm showing you an example from the Society's first published tract, written in 1919, which shows that they favoured an interventionist kind of verbal hygiene, making speech conform to what they considered sound principles through what they called slight modifications and advantageous changes. And they appear to have seen the advent of broadcasting as a golden opportunity to put their ideas into practice. When the SEEK was first formed, Bridges presented a proposal that BBC announcers should speak in a radically different way from the prevailing upper class norm. For instance, they should pronounce all the R's in words, like the Scots and the Irish do, and they should not reduce the unstressed vowels to a colourless schwa. Now, obviously, this was not a very practical suggestion. You couldn't just tell 20th century Southern English announcers to start speaking as if they'd grown up in the Middle Ages and expect them to be able to do it. And even if it had been possible, it would have sounded utterly bizarre to the listening public. The linguists on the committee knew it was a non-starter. Lloyd James, who as the secretary had a lot of control over the way decisions were implemented, just kept telling Bridges that it would take time to do something so radical, until eventually Bridges died and the proposal could be laid to rest with him. The SEEK made other wacky proposals, which I don't really have time to describe, but my point is that the advent of broadcasting in Britain did genuinely open up a space for debate on spoken language norms, both within the BBC and beyond it. Until the mid-1930s, all the SEEK's recommendations were published in Radio Times, and they got a lot of comments from listeners, which sometimes led to revisions and guidance for announcers. People even questioned whether Southern English, or what we would now call RP, was the best choice for radio. George Gordon, a Scot who would later join the committee himself, wrote a letter in which he remarked, this is a quote, "Delightful as South Country English can be, lucid articulation is hardly its strength. It shines rather in the ease of conversation than in public utterance." In the 1920s, people were still thinking of radio as a kind of oratorical medium rather than an intimate or conversational one. The standard story about the early BBC is that it was hideously snobbish and ultra-prescriptive, but what I see in the archived documents is a more complicated picture. At least some people made an effort to distinguish what was valuable in educated speech from what was merely conventional or socially accepted. And I do think that's an important distinction that often doesn't get enough consideration in more recent discussions of spoken language skills. But while anxieties about social class have continued to shape those discussions right up to the present day, over the past 50 years, we've also seen the rise of an approach to spoken language which is less concerned with things like spoken language grammar, pronunciation, or mastery of elite speech genres. And it's also different from the approach to Oracy, which emphasizes the importance of talking for learning. Usually it's not labeled Oracy or spoken language, but communication skills. It's strongly associated with workplace and vocational training, where it's spawned an industry of consultants, trainers, material developers, and coaches. And this is the phenomenon that I investigated in the 1990s, the decade when it really took off, for my book, Good to Talk. In educational institutions, this approach has had some influence as part of a broader movement to teach and test what are called key skills or core skills. A concept which, as this slide explains, has been around since the 1970s and which developed in response to the concerns of employers about school leavers lacking the basic competencies they would need when they entered the world of work. Key skills, including communication, entered the formal curriculum originally as an assessed component of NVQs, National Vocational Qualifications, and then they were adopted more widely in post-compulsory education as part of Curriculum 2000, a reform of A-levels, which has now been largely undone. But the key skill component was generally considered a failure almost from the outset, because it was seen as a kind of remedial program for less able students. Those who had C grades or above in GCSE English or maths weren't required to do the corresponding key skills module during their A-levels, and students who did do it generally hated it. Universities tended not to give much weight to it when considering applications, and employers went on complaining that school leavers didn't have the right skills. However, to the extent it did and still does have a presence in education, the spoken language element of key skills shows the influence of ideas about good communication which emanated from the business and corporate world rather than from within education itself. These ideas are highly normative, but the norms are not things like speak clearly and grammatically correct English. To show you what I'm talking about, on this slide, I've reproduced a list of skills from a page called What Are Communication Skills on Indeed.com, which is a site for job ads and career advice. It's typical of the kind of material that was being used to train employees in the workplaces where I observed in the 1990s, which included call centers, shops, supermarkets, restaurant chains, and airlines. Those employees were also being told about and often assessed by supervisors or mystery shoppers on skills like active listening, friendliness, confidence, empathy, body language, and so forth. And what's very striking about this approach is that it's not really concerned at all about either the content of speech or its form in the sense of grammar and pronunciation, or rhetorical structure and style. It's much more about communication as a means to present yourself to others and forge relationships with others. So the prescriptions are not about language as such, they're more about the personal dispositions that you should use both language and non-verbal cues to display, such as attentiveness, friendliness, openness, positivity, receptiveness to criticism, empathy with the feelings of others. One of the tasks I set myself during my research was to track these norms back to their source. Where did these ideas about good or effective communication come from, and what knowledge base, if any, underpinned them? The short answer turned out to be that they're a mishmash. Some of them originated in mid-20th century behaviorist psychology. Quite a number are taken from slightly later therapeutic practices like assertiveness training, transactional analysis, group or couples therapy, the recovery movement, and the 1970s personal growth movement. And there's also more of more than a dash of what you might call snake oil, the law of the successful salesman or businessman, as represented in classic "This is what worked for me" texts like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Actually, it's all snake oil in the sense that there's no solid evidence base for any of it. The psychologists and therapists who developed approaches like assertiveness training had no special linguistic expertise, and their rules are often massively at odds with the empirical facts about how speakers actually communicate. Even if they served a purpose in their original context, therapy itself, there's no obvious reason why these norms should be adopted in every other context, or indeed any other context. But in that case, you might be thinking, why did they become so influential in the corporate world? Why, around 1998, did I watch washing machine salesmen being taught about transactional analysis and call center agents being graded on how often and effectively they projected empathy with the caller? Well, in Good to Talk, I argued that this way of thinking about communication and operationalizing it in workplace training was one response to the way economic change was also changing ideas about work, employability, and leadership in the 1990s. So you have this transition to the new economic order that had various names in social science and in the world. They said things like, well, the decline of manufacturing means more people in the affluent parts of the world are going to be doing service jobs or knowledge work, which rely much more heavily on language and communication than traditional industrial employment. In the service sector, communication was being perceived as a possible source of competitive advantage in a deregulated marketplace for services like, banking or phone directory inquiries, which offered maximal choice, but in reality, minimal differentiation by quality or price. So, you know, how you communicated became part of your brand. The rise of a new managerialist culture with flatter hierarchies, more teamwork, more flexibility, self-motivation, and so on. The idea was that communication skills were more important and further down the hierarchy than they had been before, to kind of get abreast of these new ideas about how to organize organizations. And there were also some new and influential ideas about leadership, in particular, that great leaders needed emotional intelligence as well as the ordinary kind. So then Daniel Goleman, bestseller of that title, first appeared in 1995. So as you saw when I showed you the slide taken from Indeed.com, this was not just a passing fad. In fact, I think some of the points made by the English Speaking Union website about Oracy enhancing social and interpersonal skills are more directly related to this newer communication skills paradigm, where the focus is on cultivating and displaying psychological dispositions, than to the older Oracy paradigm, where the focus is more on extending speakers' linguistic repertoires to include more formal, more complex, or more cognitively demanding kinds of talk. So, okay, let me try and sum up. What is the trouble with Oracy? Well, three interconnected points that I've been making. First of all, Oracy has been taken on board or co-opted by a number of different projects championed by different stakeholders who both define it differently and want it to serve different purposes. Even if schools had more resources, it would be impossible for them to meet so many competing expectations around what people should be able to do with talk. The second point is that, as so often in Britain, social class divisions and the associated anxieties have caused trouble both for attempts to define good spoken communication. Often it's been either equated with the speech habits of an elite class or what they do in public schools, or else it's been framed very reductively as a set of basic competencies needed but lacked by less able and low status students. So they've operated with a deficit model. And my third point is that Oracy has been vulnerable to being either squeezed out or recruited to the populist cause of going back to basics, which in the domain of language usually means insisting that children must be taught to use English correctly. The school policies I showed you and the Ofsted reports I mentioned show how spoken language is currently being treated really as another means of policing adherence to the norms of standard English. And finally, I'd just like to re-emphasize the difficulty of setting standards everyone can agree on for something which is highly variable, radically context dependent, and strongly linked to social and personal identity. The conclusion that I've come to over the years is perhaps a paradoxical one. I do believe that developing people's spoken language skills is both possible and desirable, but I also believe that efforts to measure those skills and the performance of individuals will always cause the kinds of problems that I've been discussing. So, okay, and the hope that you did kind of get all that canter through everything.
I have a question to ask, if I may, before we open up to questions from the audience. And please, everyone, do feel free to put up your question, comments in Q&A. And we'll come to those in a minute. I see we're already getting some questions in there. Firstly, Debbie, we've been talking about, you left the discussion there on a very cogent point, I think, about how we assess and define the notion of oracy. And we've been discussing a bit so far in the conference, and indeed almost every session has ended with this question. I'll come back to this question if you don't mind, about what good oracy is. And within our subfield of linguistics, our sort of our subdiscipline, communication and discourse analysis, there's an idea that in order to be well and easily understood, speech, spoken language has to contain elements that make it both cohesive and coherent. So it's the Hallidayan analysis of how texts are formed and understood and communicated. And I have been thinking about this for a few years now, and about how an orator or a speech giver like Donald Trump, whose addresses, speeches contain neither cohesion or cohesiveness. The interrelationship of thoughts that he was communicating, it just wasn't there. There were, he'd say one thing, he'd say another, but he still achieved his communicative aims. He got his message across by producing these sort of keywords. It was almost just an assortment of keywords jumbled together in this sort of speech soup. But he still achieved what he was wanting to achieve in a lot of these addresses and speeches. And I wondered to what degree you thought that cohesiveness actually does help to define what we mean by good oracy.
Well, I think you probably gathered from my talk that I'm not that interested in prescribing. It really depends on the context. It really depends on the genre. And I think the example that you just gave of Trump is a good one, because it shows, how even if we talk about political speech or whatever, this is a very internally varied sort of set of practices. And there's been a lot of discussion in, the linguistics of broadcast speech and so on, of how the coming of different media changes that. Twitter was a great medium for Trump. It was a great medium for Sarah Palin before. Neither would stand up to any traditional definition of a great orator. But perhaps today, you don't really need to be, in that sense, a great orator. I can't think of a single one in the Westminster Parliament, for instance. I mean, they're all, from that point of view, it seems to me they're all terrible, incompetent. But I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has a very good grasp of traditional oratory. She can do the other stuff as well. But, every time you try to set standards for speech, you've got some model of speech in your mind. But it may not be the same model as the person next to you, and certainly not the same model as the employer who's complaining that you're not teaching your students the right skills. I think because speech has such an enormous range of functions and styles, it's just really, really difficult to do. And efforts to teach it in schools, except in a very narrow specification, such as, say, elocution in the 20th century sense, or debating, they have tended to founder on this inability to specify what it is we mean and how we would actually justify the criteria we're using. And then assessment, especially of anything interactive, becomes even more difficult. I mean, there were many research findings back in the 90s which were showing, for instance, that boys tended to get better grades than girls because the girls were facilitating them in talking when discussion was an assessed thing. And this was one of the reasons the GCSE and Scottish Standard Grade assessments were changed, because it was not fair. And I just don't think that if you understand speech, you can truly think that those problems are just transcendable by having a better and better and better definition.
Thanks very much, Debbie. We'll move on. We'll take some questions from the audience. So we have firstly a question here from Matthew Christmas, who I think is from the English Speaking Union. He asks, to what extent do you think that while the technical term oracy seeks to put the skills on the same level as literacy and numeracy, it's also poorly understood generally, except by experts in the field? And the sort of second counterpart, the additional question, that is it a step back to refer to oracy as, for example, speaking and listening skills, as they are A, better understood, and B, they put listening alongside simply talking, winning at debates and so on?
I think the definitions I showed, which were what I got just by doing a Google search, show that it is poorly understood. I don't think it has had if those definitions foregrounded all different things like clarity versus grammatically correct versus, they were very impoverished compared to what I think oracy meant to the people who coined and tried to promote it as a term. So no, but I think it partakes of a general problem. If you say speaking and listening, you're still leaving it very open what you mean.
Sure.
I gave the example of the employer who was like, no, I don't care if they can make a presentation. They've got to be able to build rapport with callers on the phone. It just covers such an enormous number of possibilities in different contexts and genres that it's difficult to get any content into it, really. Whereas if you say reading and writing skills, you might say that what most people understand by that is rather impoverished. It just means the ability to decode and encode correctly. But at least there's agreement on it. I think we can say that most people understand what it means the same way, and I don't think that's true for speaking and listening, whatever you call it.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Next question, and this is quite a big one. What do you think needs to change to make Oracy education better? If you dare to approach that, how do you think it could be done?
I think that there would have to be more agreement on what we want it to do, because it really can't be all things to all people. Stakeholders, by which I mean not the pupils themselves, but the people who are saying it ought to be taught. So, for example, I think that Oracy, in the kind of sense that Wilkinson meant it, and that Neil Mercer and his associates mean it, is very much about using talk to further children's learning, and that is a totally different thing from using it to make them, persuasive rhetoricians or more employable or whatever it is. I mean, for example, if you're using talk, because you believe that rich and complex talk helps children to think through ideas that are complicated, it makes them better able to do anything from history to science, then one thing you don't want to be doing is focusing on the form of it. You don't want to be stopping them as they talk through their idea and saying, well, actually in standard English we say this, or actually if you want that to be persuasive, do you want to use another word? You just don't want to do that. It's a completely different set of things so the learning through talk model of Oracy, I think is only minimally overlapping with the idea of, teach them elite genres like debate or how to make a speech. Or I think we would have to have much more talk about what Oracy education was meant to do. And I think we would absolutely have to get off this obsession with Oracy as the handmaid of literacy, and therefore it's all about forbidding anything that doesn't belong to the written standard. Those school policies, those speaking complete sentences things, they're not doing anything to advance Oracy. They're also, I would argue, not doing anything to advance literacy either, but that's clearly supposed to be the point of them. And we really would have to separate that out.
Yeah. And I think, it's a very good point. I think the multiple uses and understandings, conceptions of the term Oracy, that's one thing that we're trying to bring to the fore through this conference. Then, particularly, nod to that through the title of the conference, Uses of Oracy. We're mindful of the various ways in which this phrase is used, and I think it's with that in mind, sort of focusing in discussion of how we're using the term will hopefully going ahead would be very useful. Very closely related to that point you're making there about the relationship to the written language, Dan Clayton asks here, do you think that attempts to make spoken English more like the written language might well be trying to give more power to working class students, but in practice are missing the power and flexibility of non-standard English?
The short answer to that is probably yes. It's interesting. There have always been, and I think somebody referred to this yesterday at the session on other times and places, that there have always been cases of working class people getting together and studying grammar, like Cobden's grammar, or learning to do certain kinds of elite rhetoric. I'm absolutely not against that. I think one of the best ways I think Oracy education can do a great deal by just giving students more chance to engage in a whole variety of genre and spoken performance and so on, some of which they already do. Nobody's ever put like grime into an Oracy program, but why not? So I think I'm remembering that when I worked at Strathclyde University, the woman who ran the office, who was a Glasgow working class woman, she and some of her friends, they were in Toastmasters International, and so a kind of debating and speech making organization, and they'd had a lot of training, and they did find that empowering as well as fun. I'm not against that, but you know, if you're an education system, schools can't do everything. That's and you know, I think we've seen over the years the kind of, when they're burdened with too many conflicting duties, what happens? Not very much that's positive. And so I think that if we are going to put Oracy formally into the curriculum, we would have to narrow our scope to what do we want it to do. But I do think that these attempts to make it closer to the written language are usually based on not having a very clear idea of what speech is like, which most people don't. You know, our writing is not a representation of speech, it's our mental representation of language. You know, the hardest thing to learn when you begin a linguistics degree is that everything you think you know about language, you actually just know about writing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think we've sort of dealt with the changes in the education system that we might wish to see. Judith asks, there's two sort of interrelated questions here. I think we'll make these the last question of the session. Judith asks, is it possible to challenge back to basics definitions of oracy when the majority of people have opinions about what constitutes good language? And that opens up debates to ideas around language ideologies and beliefs about what language and good language is. And Tom, our PI, Tom Wright, asks, are there versions of Oracy that are compatible with back to basics populism and sort of popular notions of what Oracy good speech means? And can this specific problem be transcended?
Well, I think that it would depend who you asked. I mean, it seems to me that two groups of people have been either consulted or have weighed in over and over again. One of those groups is employers, who will always say, we want people who speak correctly, who are clear, articulate, and essentially, you know, can take instructions of whatever sort exist in their particular kind of workplace. This is what they're complaining about. They're not complaining that their employees are not eloquent or fully engaged as citizens. And so I think there's been an overemphasis on what they think, which is very back to basic-y in exactly the way you'd expect when we're dealing with, you know, managerial models within capitalism or whatever. But another group of people who have not been so much being consulted as weighed in is these back to basics traditionalists, things like in the 80s, the Center for Policy Studies. I think if you asked people, you know, what do they consider good speech, a wider range of people, you would get some interesting answers. You know, I think a place where I look for ordinary speech that is, you know, cogent and to the point and so on, is certain reality shows. I think the people on Gogglebox are good speakers, apart from the one middle class couple. No, they're okay too, but very different. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of models of what good speech is, and if you just say to people what's good speech, they're going to sort of dredge up the most dominant ideological discourse, which is, oh, it's clear, it's articulate, it's formal, it's in complete sentences. I don't think that is what people necessarily value in speech, but they rarely get a chance to articulate, you know, what they like.
Yeah. Debbie, that's been wonderful. Thanks very much for your time today and for your thoughts. I've certainly gained a huge amount from that, and have a lot to rethink and to phrase slightly differently in my research and my teaching. So thanks very much again.